Hi again. Okay, this will be the lecture, I guess it's the seventh lecture in our course, English 203 this term. This is the lecture for Tuesday, February 2nd. And in this lecture, we are going to begin our look at the second module of our course. This course that we have on early modern traditions of thinking and talking about the phenomenon of love. And the second module, as you guys know, is under the heading of what's called Neoplatonism. And I want to begin, obviously, by talking a bit about what we mean by that. We are talking about the philosophy of Plato, obviously. The great philosopher of the 4th century BC in classical Athens. So that's approximately 2,000 years before the early modern period itself that we're looking at. And we are talking about a revival of the philosophy of Plato, thus Neoplatonism, New Platonism. Plato's philosophy, and there's a long and complex kind of intellectual history story here. Plato's philosophy having kind of, let's say, disappeared for a long time, or at least not be known, especially in Western Europe, for a long time, was rediscovered in the 15th century. And ended up having a huge, and I would say lasting, influence on the intellectual development of the Western world. That's a very, very big story, of course, that we don't have time to tell, but we can just say really briefly, and those of you who spend time in the philosophy department will, of course, already be familiar with these general points. We can say very briefly that Plato's is, so when we talk of Plato's philosophy, that's a huge thing. It's almost a whole library unto itself. Plato is a diverse philosopher, let's say, but overwhelmingly Plato's goals, Plato's interests as a philosopher are, let's say, epistemological, which means, and we don't need to know that word, but that is the word. That means they have to do with the nature and theory of knowledge. And metaphysical, which means that his ideas have to do with the nature and theory of existence or being. So a great big sticky ball of wax. What we're interested in is that aspect of Plato's philosophy where he addresses the phenomenon of love and addresses it. And here's the thing, and here's why we're actually reading Plato's Symposium. He addresses that phenomenon very famously and very, very influentially. I mean, I would go so far as to say that this selection that we have for our main reading this week, this PDF from Plato's Symposium, this is certainly one of the most influential texts in the history of the world. It's that kind of thing. Whether or not that kind of strikes us immediately, I'm here to try to explain what makes it such a big deal. Pressing forward just a little bit with some general remarks about the nature of Plato's philosophy, we can introduce quite briefly and usefully, I think, a term that describes the kind of philosophy that it in general is, although we then have to qualify this term quite carefully, as we'll see. In general, we say that Plato's philosophy is an idealism, okay? A philosophical idealism. However, and this is the part where we have to be careful, when we say that Plato's philosophy is an idealist philosophy, we do not mean that it is a philosophy that is primarily directed toward the questions of politics or morality. It's not idealist in that sense, in the sense of wanting a perfect world or something like that. No, Plato's philosophy is an idealism in a metaphysical, or another word meaning something very similar, an ontological sense. So it's a philosophy that is focused on and driven by, let's say, a certain account of the nature of reality. That's the level at which we're operating with Plato. Plato is driven by questions about what fundamentally exists, what's real, or what's really real, the kind of phrasing you find yourself getting into sometimes when you're trying to talk about Plato. And what is real for Plato in the last analysis are a set of what we can call ideal entities, sometimes called the ideas, sometimes called the forms. So the world we see around us for Plato, and which we take in an ordinary way to be real, for Plato, this world that we see around us is not real in the last analysis. It's not really real. Rather, the world we see around us is a kind of copy or reflection of ultimate or ideal or true reality. And what does that mean in practice? Well, it means that for Plato, let's say, for example, a given situation between people where questions of fairness or justice arise, like, you ate my ice cream in my corner of the fridge or whatever. None of that is necessarily real for Plato, but the idea of justice is. That idea, that concept, that abstraction, that's real. Another example for Plato, a situation, let's say, in which you buy some oranges and you're counting those oranges to make sure that you got as many as you paid for. That situation is, let's say, dubiously real for Plato. I mean, do you really have oranges? Are you really there? Are you really counting them, etc.? Well, we're not sure. But number is real for Plato. Mathematics is real for Plato, again, at that higher and therefore true level of reality. So it is a philosophy directed toward and animated, driven by this notion of a separation or distinction between the ordinary level of reality in which we live and move and breathe, and this higher or other level of reality, which for Plato is the real reality, so to speak, and what populates that higher and more authentic level of reality are ideal entities of various kinds, which are sometimes called the ideas and sometimes called the forms. The, of course, full version of this picture is horrendously complicated and heavily hierarchized and so on and so forth. But that's enough, I think, to give us a basic sketch of Plato's idealism. And then to reconnect that general sketch to our concerns and our text, Plato would recognize that as we go through life, it seems to us that we may find ourselves sometimes in situations which we consider situations of love with another person, whether it be a family member or a lover or what have you. And again, that's ordinary life for Plato, which is not necessarily real. But Plato would say, and of course Plato does say in our text this week, the Symposium, Plato would say love as an entity, as an idea, as a form, love is real. But as we will see, and this is where the Platonic tradition in this area starts to become so very important and influential. Love is real for Plato, but precisely it's as an ideal. It is an ideal love that is really real, and that, as we will see, is distinguished in Plato and in the Platonic tradition from what we may ordinarily call love as we move around in this world and this life. Okay, two more general introductory points that we need to get on the table before we turn to our actual encounter with Plato's text. And these are both points having to do with the nature of society and culture in ancient Greece, which is where we are when we are reading Plato in classical Athens. The first of these two introductory points has to do with the nature of Greek religion. Obviously, when we are reading Plato, 4th century BC, we are well before the coming of Christianity. We are in a culture of classical Greece, which is a pagan culture, and that means that they worship natural forces and powers, such as wheat, wine, the ocean, the wind, the sky, and these natural forces and powers are anthropomorphized, given a name, Zeus, Athena, Poseidon, etc., given attributes, given stories of various kinds, and the forces that the Greeks worshipped, of course, also included moral abstractions of various kinds. So wisdom, sleep, war, these are all gods in the Greek system. And of course, love, too, is one of those divinities in ancient Greek paganism. And it's conventional, and I hope useful to effect a little distinction here between this Greek paganism that we're sketching very quickly and the Christianity that then supplanted it, and Roman paganism beginning in the late antique period, and the distinction or the switch that we can lay on the table works like this. In Christianity, as some of you guys will know, it is conventional to say that God is love. God is love. We can understand the nature of Greek paganism rather quickly just by turning that around. The Greeks would not have said God is love, and they would not have understood what that meant. The Greeks don't say God is love. The Greeks say love is a god. Okay? Love is a god, just as war is a god, hatred is a god, the wind is a god, wisdom is a god, sleep is a god, wheat is a god, olive oil is a god, and so on. So this is the origin of the god of love imagery that we already encountered. This is the deep classical origin of that god of love imagery we've already encountered in our course. And again, that Greek pagan religious framework is one that we need to be clear about if we're going to be able to read Plato's Symposium. And then the second and last introductory point that I want to get on the table has to do with the nature of ancient Greek and perhaps especially classical Athenian sexuality. We today in this society, despite a lot of the changes that have occurred in the way we think about these matters in recent years, I think it's probably safe to say that we in this society in 21st century Canada still basically live in what would be called, in gender studies, we still basically live in a heteronormative society. Heteronormative, meaning that the baseline expectation of our society is still that boys get with girls, girls get with boys, and even though we've diversified that picture a great deal, let's say, I think it's probably safe to say that's still the baseline attitude of our society. And just to be completely clear, I'm not selling that, I'm just observing that. Ancient Greek society is not like that, and this is the point that we need to be aware of. In ancient Greek society, in classical Athenian society, certainly, the baseline expectation is same-sex relationships. That is, especially to say, same-sex relationships among males. That is actually the default that Plato represents as characterizing his society in terms of its sexual arrangements. And so rather than a heteronormative society, we can say when we're looking at classical Athens that we are looking at a homonormative society, same-sex relationships, especially among males, being understood as the kind of default or proper, let's say, social expectation. Okay, and with those points on the table, we then can turn to our selection from the Symposium. The Symposium is a dialogue, like almost all of Plato's works, and That is to say, it is an imaginary conversation that Plato writes as his way of grappling with whatever topic he wants to grapple with on that day. Very typically in Plato, and the Symposium is no exception, the members of the conversation are actually real. They are real members of ancient Athenian society and culture from the generation just before Plato's own. Some of them are very famous, some of them less so, but typically they're real historical figures whom Plato brings into the room, so to speak, of his mind, and he has them engage in an imaginary conversation about this or that topic. In the case of the Symposium, as we know, the topic that they are going to discuss is love. And again, very typically, the central figure of the dialogue is Socrates, about whom we can just say a couple of things very briefly. Socrates, of course, had been Plato's teacher. Socrates, so again, a real historical figure. Socrates invented not philosophy as such, but certainly invented a certain conception of what it was to do philosophy, a conception in which the examined life, to use the traditional phrase, is the purview and the business of philosophy. It is a moral approach to what philosophy basically is that Socrates pioneered. A guy then who is a kind of celebrity of classical Athens in his own time, Plato's teacher. And then the other thing we need to know about Socrates is that he was, of course, put to death, executed by the Athenian state in 399 BC on a charge of corrupting the youth of Athens. So in the Symposium, as he always does, Plato is executing his own philosophical project by putting words in the mouth of his dead teacher, Socrates, his murdered teacher, if you like. So there's a retrospective aspect to what Plato does. There's perhaps an ironic aspect. There's perhaps a tragic aspect as Plato brings his teacher, put to death by the state, into an imaginary room to have an imaginary conversation about love with a bunch of Athenian A-listers from the generation just before his own. Okay, and with that, we can turn to the argument of the Symposium, or rather the arguments of the Symposium. What happens in the dialogue is we're at a drinking party, as I have stated in the heading to our PDF. Drinking party is symposion, which gives us then in Latin symposium, if you ever go to an academic symposium, you may find that that etymology is not totally misleading. But anyway, they're at a drinking party, and all these A-lister Athenian males, some are couples, some are not, and they fall to talking, and somebody proposes, hey, let's make speeches about love, and they do. So we get a whole bunch of speeches about love and accounts of love in the dialogue. We're looking at three of them, the three main ones. The first of which is delivered by a figure called Pausanias, who is not actually a very important figure historically. He's kind of here as somebody else's date, somebody's plus one, but he does lay out the first kind of significant argument that we have to consider as we build up our picture, because this is what we're trying to do right now. We build up our picture of this Platonic/Neoplatonic tradition of talking about what love basically is. Pausanias, in his speech, introduces a key idea, which is going to be basic to the rest of the dialogue, and in fact, basic or fundamental to the whole Platonic tradition of thinking about love. The idea that Pausanias introduces is there's actually more than one kind of love, or there's more. The way he puts it is just to say there's more than one love. As he says at the very beginning of our PDF, he says, the argument has not been set before us, I think, quite in the right form. We should not be called upon to praise love in such an indiscriminate manner. If there were only one love, then what you said would be well enough. But since there are more loves than one, we should have begun by determining which of them was to be the theme of our praises. And in this somewhat difficult and confusing opening to Pausanias' remarks, he goes on to give an account from within Greek religion, according to which there's actually two gods of love. The god of love, that Cupid figure that we still are familiar with, he, of course, is supposed to be the son of Aphrodite, the goddess of love. So that's already very confusing. There is a goddess of love, Aphrodite, or Venus in the Roman form. And then she has this little boy, Eros, or Cupid. He's the god of love. Pausanias says, yeah, but there's two Aphrodites, he says. There's a heavenly Aphrodite, and there's a common Aphrodite. As I said, he's operating from within the context of the ancient Greek religion, and they do this kind of thing sometimes in the ancient Greek religion. It can be horrendously complex. We don't need to worry about that too much. What we need to zero in on and remember is just this idea that Pausanias introduces that, okay, we're talking about love, but let's be careful and specific because there's actually two of those guys. A higher one and a lower one. And the insight that Pausanias is having and sharing with us is that, there's a right way and a wrong way of doing everything, or a right way and a wrong way of thinking about everything. As he says in the second paragraph of our PDF, he says, now actions vary according to the manner of their performance. Take, for example, that which we are now doing, drinking, singing, and talking. These actions are not in themselves either good or evil, but they turn out in this or that way according to the mode of performing them. And when well done, they are good, and when wrongly done, they are evil. And in like manner, not every love, but only that which has a noble purpose, is noble and worthy of praise. Pausanias is saying, just as, there's good drinking and bad drinking, I guess, virtuous drinking and sinful drinking, or whatever your example would be, in much the same way, Pausanias is saying, we've got to understand that there's good love and bad love, okay? So before we can decide what our attitude to love is, we need to recognize that there is some approaches to love which are good and noble and virtuous, other approaches to love which are common and sinful and wicked. And as Pausanias goes on, the argument that he makes and the claim that he advances is good, noble, virtuous love, that higher kind of love, coming from a being that he calls heavenly Aphrodite. That's the kind of love that he and his fellow male Athenian A-listers practice. That same-sex love among male Athenian aristocrats, basically, that's good, noble, virtuous love. And the basis for this claim, and it is a totally sexist, if not misogynist basis for the claim that Pausanias makes, and that becomes very important in this dialogue. The basis for the claim being, look, men are just better. That's the idea. Men are more intelligent. They have superior souls. That's the idea. So the love of that higher being, the male, who is smarter, has a more powerful mind, a more beautiful soul, that's got to be good, noble, virtuous love. Love of other kinds of beings, including women, not so much. So Pausanias says here at the beginning, top of page 2, again talking about this higher, noble, virtuous love. He says, those who are inspired by this love turn to the male and delight in him who is the more valiant and intelligent nature. Anyone may recognize the pure enthusiasts in the very character of their attachments, for they love not boys, but intelligent beings whose reason is beginning to be developed much about the time at which their beards begin to grow, a classical statement of the classical Athenian attitude. So, two kinds of love, Pausanias has told us, and as he develops the ideal, this idea, two kinds of love, they're divided between higher and lower, between virtuous and unvirtuous, and along the same lines, the love of males, that's supposed to be that higher, more virtuous kind of love, because males are supposed to be higher beings, and this accordingly is supposed to be, as Pausanias develops his claim, which again I am not selling, just reporting on, right? And I'm looking now at the middle of page 2 in our PDF. In the middle of that long paragraph, Pausanias says, "There is dishonor in yielding to the evil or in an evil manner, but there is honor in yielding to the good or in an honorable manner. Evil is the vulgar lover who loves the body rather than the soul, inasmuch as he is not even stable." That is the vulgar lover. Because he loves a thing which is in itself unstable, and therefore when the bloom of youth which he was desiring is over, he takes wing and flies away in spite of all his words and promises. Whereas the love of the noble disposition is lifelong, for it becomes one with the everlasting. That's enough on this opening argument of the Symposium, the argument made in the speech of Pausanias. And it is really useful for our purposes because already in that argument that Pausanias makes, we have the outlines of what subsequently is called Platonic love. Not necessarily because of the emphasis on same-sex relations as such. We can actually, if we want to, we can remove or detach the sexism or misogyny of Pausanias' argument while still having the main lines of the Platonic idea that is there. And the main lines involve this distinction between two kinds of love, a good kind and a bad kind, a noble kind and an ignoble kind, and so on. The accompanying insistence that what you want to do is pursue the noble, virtuous, higher kind of love. And finally, a very, very important Platonic idea. That means being in love with a soul, not being in love with a body. Because the body is sort of vulgar and low by definition. And of course, it's also temporary. Bodies decay, souls don't. That's the idea. Okay, that then is the opening argument of the Symposium, and it kind of lays down a baseline for us. Let's go on and look at the second argument, which is delivered by a man called Aristophanes. Now, he is a very, very famous figure of classical Athenian culture. He was a comic playwright, and in fact, he wrote a very famous play where he made fun of Socrates. And he tells a story which is itself very funny. It's unclear how seriously we are supposed to take it, but that's how it is with comedy. Aristophanes tells this story about sexual types and types of sexual preference, in fact. He says, near the beginning of his speech, he says, "In the first place, let me treat of the nature of man and what has happened to it. For the original human nature was not like the present, but different. The sexes were not two as they are now, but originally three in number. There was man, woman, and the union of the two having a name corresponding to this double nature." And Aristophanes goes on to explain that the primeval man, so what human beings were first, the primeval man was round. It's sort of a Mr. Men picture that he builds up. The primeval man was round, his back and sides forming a circle, and he had 4 hands and 4 feet, one head with 2 faces looking opposite ways, set on a round neck and precisely alike. Also 4 ears, 2 privy members, private parts, and the remainder to correspond. He could walk upright as men now do, backwards or forwards as he pleased, and he could also roll over and over at a great pace, turning on his 4 hands and 4 feet, 8 in all, like tumblers going over and over with their legs in the air. This was when he wanted to run fast. Now the sexes were 3, and such as I have described them, because the sun, moon, and earth are three, and the man was originally the child of the sun, the woman of the earth, and the man woman of the moon, which is made up of sun and earth, and they were all round and moved round and round like their parents. This is the comic narrative of the origins of humanity that Aristophanes builds up. And as he goes on, he says, well, these original primeval round people, double people, were so powerful that the gods became afraid of them, and accordingly Zeus decided to cut them in half. This is now at the bottom of page 3 in our PDF. Zeus says, methinks I have a plan which will humble their pride and improve their manners. Men shall continue to exist, but I will cut them in two, and then they will be diminished in strength and increased in numbers. This will have the advantage of making them more profitable to us. They shall walk upright on two legs, and if they continue insolent and will not be quiet, I will split them again, and they shall hop about on a single leg. He spoke and cut men in two, like a sorb apple, which is halved for pickling, whereas you might divide an egg with a hair. And so the story Aristophanes tells, you've got these primeval people, double people, round. One is male, male, one is woman, female, female, and one is female, male. Zeus cuts them in half. So the male, male Mr. Man becomes two men. The woman, woman Mr. Person, or whatever, becomes two women. The man, woman ball becomes a man and a woman. And after various other hijinks and shenanigans in Aristophanes' tale, he derives from it an account of love, or at least an account of desire. So we are talking very much about erotic and amorous and sexual desire in Aristophanes' story. So I'm looking now at page 4 in our PDF, the second long paragraph that begins on this page, where Aristophanes says, each of us when separated, having one side only, like a flat fish, is but the indenture of a man, which indenture just means a half section. Is but the indenture of a man, and he is always looking for his other half. Men who are a section of that double nature which was once called androgynous are lovers of women. Adulterers are generally of this breed, and also adulterous women who lust after men. The women who are a section of the woman, the double woman, the women who are a section of the woman do not care for men, but have female attachments. The female companions are of this sort. But they who are a section of the male, the double man, they who are a section of the male follow the male. And while they are young, being slices of the original man, they hang about men and embrace them, and they are themselves the best of boys and youths, because they have the most manly nature. So we still have in Aristophanes' tale this kind of hierarchy of sexual preferences that we talked about earlier, with male-male sexual attraction being obviously at the peak of Aristophanes' system, most admirable and praiseworthy, and so on. Interestingly and quite unusually, Aristophanes' story does, however, also leave open, or has to have open, an important place also for female-female same-sex attraction, those kinds of women in Aristophanes' comic vision who are halves of the original female whole, and then opposite sex attraction in Aristophanes' tale comes from people who were originally part of that male-female whole. So still that Athenian economy of sexual preferences, but, and this is really important, I think, in Aristophanes' tale, love is really physical or even sexual by definition. It is still a yearning for the soul, the other half of yourself in that way, in Aristophanes' story. But at the same time, it's very clear, and he's quite graphic about this, it's very clear that it is a yearning for the soul which has to proceed through the body. It is a yearning to attain physical union with that other half of yourself, your lost other self. Um, um, as Aristophanes says at the end of his speech, a goal, a desire to become one instead of two. It is a yearning for the soul, but it's a yearning for the soul which is expressed physically, is expressed through the body in Aristophanes' story. Okay, finally, let's go on and talk about the, of course, longest and most complicated argument that we have here, which is the one that we get from Socrates himself. And Socrates claims to have derived everything he knows about love from a wise old woman, interestingly. A wise old woman called Diotima. And so we get a kind of dialogue within the dialogue as Socrates relates everything that Diotima told him. And the first thing she tells him, again working from within the framework of the ancient Greek religion, the first thing she tells him is that actually we do not understand the nature of love correctly if we think that love is a god. Okay, so this is quite a major tweak, to put it mildly, of the way the Greeks would have thought about this kind of thing. Love can't be a god, she explains to Socrates. The reason being that that love is an experience of imperfection, an experience of lacking something, an experience of needing something. The gods have got to be perfect beings. This is Diotima's argument. They can't lack for anything. They can't need anything, and therefore love, according to her argument, is not actually a god at all. Rather, love is what we can call a demigod, or in the Greek term, which is in fact given in our text, love is a daimon, a great spirit, which is neither human nor divine, but intermediary between the two. So this is Diotima on page 6 of our PDF. Socrates asks her, what then is love? The question that animates this dialogue. What is love, I asked. Is he mortal? No. What then? As in the former instance, Diotima says, he is neither mortal nor immortal, but in a mean between the two. What is he, Diotima? He is a great spirit or daimon, and like all spirits, he is intermediate between the divine and the mortal. And what I said is his power. He interprets, she replied, between gods and men, conveying and taking across to the gods the prayers and sacrifices of men, and to men the commands and replies of the gods. He is the mediator who spans the chasm which divides them, and therefore in him all is bound together, and through him the arts of the prophet and the priest, their sacrifices and mysteries and charms, and all prophecy and incantation find their way. The demigod that love is, according to Socrates and Diotima, is a figure who, the word used here is interprets or communicates, let's say, between the levels of reality that are recognized both in Greek religion and in a different way in Plato's own philosophy. Love basically communicates between earth and heaven, men and the gods, lower and higher levels of being. He grants a kind of access. And that's a very, very important idea, which, as we'll see, Socrates is going to develop as he pursues this account of what love basically is. And he first of all, he pursues this through an account, a kind of allegorical account of where love came from, who love's parents are. This is very, very typical of ancient Greek literature. We get a little allegory in which love is the child of poverty and plenty, which of course is contradictory, or at least quite paradoxical. As Socrates, via Diotima, develops this account of love, it actually kind of gets harder and harder to answer this question that Socrates asked, what is love? So I'm looking now at the bottom of page 6 in our PDF. Diotima says, so we've just learned that love is the love child, as it were, of the gods, poverty and plenty. Diotima goes on to say, and as his parentage is, so also are his fortunes. In the first place, he is always poor, and anything but tender and fair as the many imagine him, and he is rough and squalid, and has no shoes, nor a house to dwell in. On the bare earth exposed, he lies under the open heaven, in the streets, or at the doors of houses, taking his rest. And like his mother, he is always in distress. Like his father, too, whom he also partly resembles, he is always plotting against the fair and good. He is bold, enterprising, strong, a mighty hunter, always weaving some intrigue or other, keen in the pursuit of wisdom, fertile in resources, a philosopher at all times, terrible as an enchanter, sorcerer, sophist. He is by nature neither mortal nor immortal, but alive and flourishing at one moment when he is in plenty, and dead at another moment, and again alive by reason of his Father's nature. But that which is always flowing in is always flowing out, and so he is never in want and never in wealth. And further, he is in a mean between ignorance and knowledge. As I said, the attempt to answer this question, Socrates' question, what is love? It seems to get harder and harder as we go through that passage, as love seems to be everything and nothing, so variously and contradictorily defined that he seems to resist definition altogether. But the one point that we can hold to as this account develops, and the point that will take us to the end of our look at the argument of the Symposium, the one point that we can pursue to the end is this idea of love as lacking, love as being in need of something, being a seeker after something. In fact, he's repeatedly described as a philosopher, love, in Socrates' argument. He's trying to satisfy a need. Love is an attraction to something. And as we move into the final part of the dialogue, love is an attraction to the beautiful. And that much is clear and kind of commonsensical and self-evident. But there's two very important qualifications that Diotima makes to the nature of the attraction to beauty that love is. The first one is she insists that love is not just an attraction to beauty, but an attraction to, the wording here is generation and birth in beauty, procreation. So this is page 8, toward the bottom, she says, "For love, Socrates, is not, as you imagine, the love of the beautiful only. What then? The love of generation and of birth in beauty." "Yes," I said. "Yes, indeed," she replied. "But why of generation? Because to the mortal creature, generation is a sort of eternity and immortality," she replied. "And if, as has been already admitted, love is of the everlasting possession of the good, all men will necessarily desire immortality together with good. Wherefore love is of immortality." So, love is not just an attraction to the beautiful, but an attraction to a kind of hope for immortality in procreation vis-a-vis the beautiful. And the next stage in Diotima's argument is when she distinguishes between two kinds of generation, two kinds of procreation, one involving the body, the other involving, and we look back to Pausanias here, the other involving the soul. So she speaks at the bottom of page 8 again about being pregnant with love. But we can be pregnant with love, evidently, in the body or in the soul. So she says, "Those who are pregnant in the body only betake themselves to women and beget children. This is the character of their love. Their offspring, as they hope, will preserve their memory and giving them the blessedness and immortality which they desire in the future. But souls which are pregnant, for there certainly are men who are more creative in their souls than in their bodies. Those who are pregnant in their souls conceive that which is proper for the soul to conceive or contain. And what are these conceptions? Wisdom and virtue in general." And I'm going to skip down now to page 9 to finish up this lecture as Diotima brings her account of what love is to its conclusion. So page 9, the paragraph in the middle, Diotima says, "For he who would proceed aright in this matter, in matters of love, he who would proceed aright in this matter should begin in youth to visit beautiful forms. And first, if he be guided by his instructor aright, to love one such form only. Out of that he should create fair thoughts, and soon he will of himself perceive that the beauty of one form is akin to the beauty of another. And then if beauty of form in general is his pursuit, how foolish would he be not to recognize that the beauty in every form is one and the same. And when he perceives this, he will abate his violent love of the one, the actual lover. He will abate his violent love of the one, which he will despise and deem a small thing, and will become a lover of all beautiful forms. In the next stage, he will consider that the beauty of the mind is more honorable than the beauty of the outward form." So we have a procedure or a progress in Plato's theory of love here, according to which you begin by loving, let's say, a beautiful person. And to be quite clear, that's not bad in Plato, that's good. You begin by being attracted to beauty in a person. But what you have to do is go into another stage where you recognize that it's not really that beautiful person that you're in love with, it's beauty in that person. So you're taught to recognize beauty through its appearance in a given person, but you're supposed to kind of get beyond or above that in Plato and realize, well, what you really love is beauty as such rather than this or that beautiful person. And after that, another stage, you're supposed to recognize that the beauty as such that you really love is to be found more in souls than in bodies. I'll skip down now to the last paragraph on page 9, where Diotima says, "He who has been instructed thus far in the things of love, and who has learned to see the beautiful in due order and succession, when he comes toward the end will suddenly perceive a nature of wondrous beauty, and this, Socrates, is the final cause of all our formal toils, a nature which in the first place is everlasting, not growing and decaying or waxing and waning. Secondly, not fair in one point of view and foul in another, or at one time, or in one relation, or at one place fair, at another time, or in another relation, or at another place foul, etc., etc. But, so the very bottom of page 9 now, beauty absolute, separate, simple, and everlasting, which without diminution and without increase or any change is imparted to the ever-growing and perishing beauties of all other things. He who from these, ascending under the influence of true love, begins to perceive that beauty is not far from the end, and the true order of going or being led by another to the things of love is to begin from the beauties of earth and mount upwards for the sake of that other beauty, using these as steps only, and from one going on to two, and from two to all fair forms, and from fair forms to fair practices, and from fair practices to fair notions, until from fair notions he arrives at the notion of absolute beauty, and at last knows what the essence of beauty is." And I'll wrap up here just in the last 90 seconds or so. What we've just heard from Socrates' Diotima between page 9 and 10 of our PDF is certainly one of the most famous and influential ideas in the history of the world, to use that cliche phrase again. It's known as the Platonic ladder of love. And the idea, again, is love is good in Platonism. Let's get that clear. And by love in Platonism, we do mean erotic, amorous love of various kinds. Love for a beautiful person, that's good in Plato's vision of love. However, it is a good that is meant to be treated only as a step on a ladder. As you go from loving that beautiful person to loving beauty as such, to loving the soul kind of beauty rather than the mind kind of beauty, and upward, arriving ultimately at a semi-mystical vision of the essence of beauty itself. That's the basis for the Platonic/Neoplatonic tradition of thinking about love. And I'm going to wrap this lecture up there. We'll talk more about all that stuff on Thursday and subsequently. Okay, thank you.